We're going to close out the morning with I think, going to be a stimulating conversation with two remarkable people who have been thinking deeply about energy, efficiency, renewables, how it all fits together, and how we need to transform our world and get where we all know we need to go. I'll just stop with that and just bring to the stage, join me in welcoming Amory Lovins and Matthew Nordan. Welcome, Amory. You sit in the middle here, or actually right here, this first one. Right there. You sit there, and you sit there. Exactly.
Hello, sir.
No, Matthew. All right, so we have to, it's a logistic. It's a little bit how we, it's the important part of this. Who sits where, I don't know. We've been talking a lot for the past almost 4 days now about a wide range of goals, a wide range of ambitions, bringing together big companies thinking about energy with entrepreneurs, with utilities, commissioners, the regulatory crowd. And I think we want to sort of tie this together in terms of how we need to, what's the path forward? And to start with that, we've heard Paul Hawken talking about drawdown. We heard about the Solutions Project that's looking at 100% renewables. What is the goal we need to get to? Amory, let's start with you. What are we optimizing for? Where do we want to get in our energy world? What's the goal?
I think an efficient, diverse, dispersed, or distributed, renewable, resilient energy system achieved rapidly and at least cost and without making new problems.
Okay. No, that's good. I like it because it's ambitious, it's aspirational, but it's also not prescriptive necessarily saying we need to get to X by Y or that we need to do it through this combination of solar and wind. In Reinventing Fire, you've laid out a plan that is more prescriptive on how to do this. And but I guess I want to start with, do we have the technologies now that to get where we want to go, to do what you just described?
Sure.
And how much of it do we need to still invent?
One of the basic assumptions behind our Reinventing Fire synthesis 3 years ago was we were only going to use technologies that were on the market or entering the market, no new inventions required. Also, no act of Congress required, led by business for profit. And the economics were pretty compelling. That's really what drives it, although if you care about national security, there are very important resilience and geopolitical kinds of benefits. If you care about climate, you might like to know there's 80-odd% less carbon emissions and so on. But to triple or quadruple energy productivity in buildings was a 33% internal rate of return. To double that of industry was 21%. To get mobility completely off oil was 17%. To do all of the above plus a half-distributed 80% renewable, highly resilient electricity system would bring the average down to 14%. And we're counting all externalities value at zero.
Right.
No carbon pricing, no positive externalities, some of which are extremely large and would just make the IRRs astronomical.
So the people who've been on stage here in the breakouts earlier, and many in the audience who say, we have to have a tax on carbon, that's fundamental to getting to where we need to go. You're saying not so much.
Well, that's not what we found. I would love to price carbon. It would be good economics. It would be helpful. It is certainly not either essential or sufficient. Of course, if we had it, what I just described would get easier to do, but it's not sufficient because if you get the prices right and don't bust barriers, not much happens, because ability to respond to price is even more important than price itself. And in the long run, it's not as important as you might suppose because there is so much unbought efficiency out there that an efficient carbon market will ultimately clear low.
Well, so I want to get from the big aspirational to a little bit more to what these people want to do Monday morning. But before, let's turn to Matthew. Matthew, you've been working as a venture capitalist and working now in projects in China and helping develop and scale efficient energy systems, the kind that Amory just described. Do we have the technology? Do you have what you need? What are the barriers, if any, to scaling this for you?
Yeah, I think there's some subtlety to it, and I worry the most about recharging the reservoir. I mean, I think in some ways, right, if you think about...
That's the innovation reservoir? Is that the metaphor?
Yeah, well, think for a minute, right? Let me ask you guys, right? So if you think about carbon-free electricity generation, or at least as close to carbon-free as we can get, bearing in mind all the stuff along the life cycle, et cetera, when's the last time we had a truly big advance, something radically different than what came beforehand, that successfully crossed the chasm and has achieved mass deployment? What do you think of? Right, but carbon-free electricity. So cell phones are awesome, but not the domain we're looking for.
Photovoltaics.
PV, yep, exactly.
Which are scaling faster than cell phones.
Hugely.
Yeah.
Totally agree with you. That's exactly right. Any others? Wind's pretty old, Wind turbines back to the, we got to get into single-digit centuries to be able to get wind turbines. What else is recent? Sorry? LEDs, okay. LEDs help. Certainly something that's very efficient. That's a good point.
Tides.
Tides. I would say that probably hasn't crossed the chasm yet, but it's a really good idea. When I do this analysis, pardon?
EVs.
EVs. Not sure we've crossed the chasm yet, but we're getting there. I mean, when I think about this analysis, right, I got to rewind the clock to 1954, which was the remarkable year that two things happened in the same year, right? On one hand, we got the first photovoltaic cell north of 1% conversion efficiency, came out of Bell Labs. And the second, regardless of what your feelings may be on the other externalities facing nuclear, it helpfully does not put CO2 into the atmosphere. At what was then the National Reacting Testing Center, we had the first guys light up light bulbs off of a nuclear pile. I can't really find something else with that level of impact since. Now, the adoption timeframes in this field are really long, and you can say in many ways the $26 billion of venture capital and growth equity money that's gone into energy and environment in the last 10, 15 years has really been tapping this reservoir, right, of innovation that built up really, I would say, through the Reagan administration. Reagan taking the solar panels off the White House was unhelpful, and we had a just receding tide of investment in energy innovation at that point. But we've drawn a lot out of that reservoir, and I'm not seeing it get recharged. So I worry when I look my daughters in the eye, right, who are 10 and 12. I've had this pool of new stuff to draw on that we've been able to drive down a cost curve and get to things like the adoption we see in PV. I wonder what they'll have to draw on when they're my age.
But isn't that part of a natural innovation cycle where innovations mature and there's tweaks, but do we really need big honking new silver bullet kinds of innovations to do what Amory says we can do right now?
So opinions will differ on this matter. I think there's some subtlety about about being able to use today's portfolio of technologies to reach 100% renewables. I'm not completely certain that all aspects of that are solved problems. With that said, what drives me really is the macro, right? If you think about what drives the world, what are the two sort of fundamental drivers? One is people. It took 200,000 years to get the first billion people. We now have 7. The UN believes we will have 11 billion, so 50% more by 2050, right? I'll still be very much alive then. And then the other is GDP per person, consumption per head, which has risen in a geometric curve since Columbus, ran into the West Indies in the 1750s. That's pretty frightening. And you spent a lot of time in China. I spent a lot of time in China. I just came here last night from Shanghai from 2 weeks in Shenzhen and Hangzhou and other areas where I and my firm are working to build things like waste-to-fuel plants and high-efficiency solar parks in China. And I look at the incredible increase in wealth. We heard it in the panel a couple of panels ago, the incredible scale of industrial and commercial development, all in the face of rising incomes. It's hard for me to look at that and not think that if humanity's been on a march of ever greater power density and ever lower cost of electricity, that we won't need to continue on that march and that won't require new technologies.
I think power density is a completely irrelevant factor. I've never found a use for that metric unless you're designing equipment that has to dissipate heat. But also being just back from China, let me report the good news that our application of reinventing fire to China using their models, modelers, data, and examples with our Chinese partners for National Development and Reform Commission is turning up cost-effective ways to increase carbon productivity by at least a factor of 15 by 2050. In other words, you could run a 6-fold bigger economy with somewhat less energy than now and get half to 3/4 of the electricity from renewables by then, and it would be cheaper than business as usual.
And they can ramp that up at
and our customers for that are the people who write the energy content of the 13th five-year plan.
And they can ramp that up in phase out or in lieu of the
They're doing that
coal
already.
plants that
The
are
coal burn January through August this year has been going down, much in advance of what people mostly expected. Last year, besides getting more electricity from wind than from nuclear the last 2 years, last year alone they installed more photovoltaic capacity than the U.S. has installed in the 60 years since we invented it,
Yep.
right? Their internal competition is playing out in a very interesting way. They don't do price, they do something sort of equivalent to economic dispatch, and in 2012 alone, their increased generation from non-hydro renewables exceeded that from fossil and nuclear combined. So they're still adding more coal plants, but retiring a lot of bad old ones, and they're running them a lot less.
So how do we do that in a non-centrally planned economy? Could we do that here?
Yeah, I think we are starting to do it here. And actually, for our Chinese partners, we tracked progress in the first 3 years of this 40-year reinventing fire journey, and the U.S. is right on target for intensity reductions and ahead of target for renewables.
And the target on a 40-year, explain that a minute, I'm not sure I followed.
In other words, a reasonable trajectory to do the reinventing fire thing over 40 years. If you look at the first 3 years for which we have data through 2013, we are on or ahead of target.
So it's all good?
No, it could be a lot better. And I'm not denying that more innovative technologies would be nifty. We're going to get a lot of those, but I don't think they're necessary. We already have enough, and therefore we focus a lot more on getting the job done, getting stuff installed, getting it installed well and cheaply, because opportunity cost matters.
It does.
And we've just run some numbers on this. If you build, for example, the latest version of what came out of the 54 nuclear stuff, if you build a new nuclear plant, you will save about 3 to 5 times less carbon per dollar than if you bought wind or photovoltaics instead, 4 to 10 times less than if you bought cogen instead, 10 to 50 times less than if you bought efficiency instead. And therefore, if you don't, if you buy costly slow stuff instead of cheap fast stuff, you're actually retarding and reducing climate protection.
Right.
That's a simple opportunity cost. So we ought to invest judiciously, not indiscriminately. All carbon-free sources are not equivalent in speed and cost.
So we've got a bunch of companies here who are trying to figure out where they play, where they fit in. How we hear every day from big companies, multi-billion-dollar global companies who are trying to grapple with solar. When build, buy, lease, wait.
And what often happens is the CEO makes a wonderful speech about we will be X% renewable by year Y, and then the purchasing department says, huh? We don't know how to buy that stuff. And the project developers of utility scale solar, for example, are used to dealing with professional buyers who buy big chunks of stuff all the time. They're not used to dealing with occasional buyers. It's like airlines interfacing with passengers who fly sometimes. And to do that, you need guidance or navigational help, you need standardization, You need exploration of bulk buys and best practice sharing. And for exactly those purposes, we're launching next week a business renewables center with several dozen corporates already signed up.
So part of the challenge is, I mean, you talk about crossing the chasm. I mean, that's the big chasm that needs to be crossed, which is how do we take the companies that are committed, engaged, needing power for their growing needs, data centers and other things, and want to do it in a way that is driving market change. How do you see, as someone who's been involved with helping technology scale, what do you think is the missing ingredient that's going to help us cross that chasm?
Ingredient. We may have a singular versus plural issue there. A few things, again, come to mind. There was the Steve Jobs phrase, right? That he wanted to make things that were insanely great, that were so obviously better than what had come beforehand that they didn't need explaining, didn't need a huge education burden, just sort of the economics and design were obvious. I had this experience as a venture capital investor in Nest, the smart thermostat company that Google bought in January of this year. You could sit down with Tony Fadell and Matt Rogers and see V1.0 of Nest, and then see the pipeline of other things that were intended to speak to it later on and get it. And they went from 2011 to 2013 with a relatively small number of thermostats in service, intelligently programmed enough that they were saving a terawatt hour of electricity a year among the Nest user base off of the AC load alone, right?
Terawatt.
I think in Austin the savings were around 50% in one experiment.
Sure, huge numbers. So that I get. Peak. I think the challenge, right, is that in a lot of these areas of renewable energy, and you've pointed to it, right, where you've said, well, we've got all this cheap solar, these cheap other renewables, but we've got a demand gap in some cases. We have people and corporations who don't know how to buy it. They can't figure it out. That speaks to me a market signal that, we can get a lot better, either for just economic forces to be able to take root and let the invisible hand drive us, or other non-economic factors that are equally obvious. And that, again, is why I go back to recharging the well. I mean, let's take solar as an example, right? So anybody in here in the solar sort of technology field? You definitely are. All right, good stuff. So what's the Shockley-Queisser limit? Okay, not that deep technology. So the Shockley-Queisser limit is this computational maxim that if you're going to have a solar panel that has a single junction, which is virtually every one that we use today, you can capture a maximum of 30-odd% of the light that hits it and convert it into electricity. And what the solar industry has been doing, and doing a very good job of, by the way, is just sort of asymptotically raising efficiencies up from the sub 10% that we're at a couple of decades ago to that Shockley-Queisser limit. But when you hit it, that's done. That's the ball game, right? That's not the behavior that we see in the semiconductor industry. It's not the scaling curve that we've seen in your phone. It's not the curve that we've seen in the efficacy of healthcare, not necessarily the cost, but the efficacy of healthcare and things like cancer treatment. And right now, there are a lot of people who are developing what comes next in solar. They have things like ARPA-E grants, right? There's a whole different way you can convert sunlight into electricity rather than using a photovoltaic and separating electron hole pairs. You would basically have a little tiny antenna that tunes in solar energy the same way that your car's radio tunes in a radio station through resonance. The nice thing about it is it doesn't have that limit. You can demonstrate that with other wavelengths, these things are up to 90% efficient. It's totally awesome. But if you're an entrepreneur in that area now, do you know where you go to get money to start your company? You go nowhere because you are launched, catapulted at high velocity into a yawning gap where on this side is the Department of Energy and ARPA-E, and on this side is the venture capital community, and nobody in the middle wants to hear you.
Yeah. So is that a role for the corporates?
I think there are a couple of roles for the corporates here, and they're going to be very different from what you had pointed to, which I think is really important, which is getting procurement right and using buying power. That's great. But I think there are two things that are sort of less immediately economic that matter a lot. One of them is inspiring the next generation of leaders. If you look around at sort of energy technology versus, the apps my daughter runs on her phone, and look for a number of aspirational figures who kids look at and think, I want to grow up to be that guy or gal, we don't have a lot of those. We have one. We have the Iron Man of renewable energy, Elon Musk. That's a household name. That's an aspirational figure, but we don't have a lot. I think corporations play an important role in shaping messages and in educating a generation of leaders when they leave university. Pointing people like this at these resource problems is important. The other one, I think, is using treasuries, right? Many corporations are venture investors of their own. Many of them are LPs and third-party venture and private equity funds. To the extent that they have pension programs, those pension programs invest large amounts of money in things that matter or not. So that's a gap that can be filled in funding new energy technology.
So before we run out of time, you gave a nod to changing the procurement, and as if that's an easy thing. And I want, Amory, how is RMI, this new center, what's the plan to transform that? I mean, give us is it just education? Do we need to be aggregating buyer power? What does it take?
It's very multifaceted, but it's basically making the buyers able to get great deals on stuff they didn't know how to buy and share best practices, standardize their business processes, go in together on bulk deals, and first of all, navigate the field so that they'll know what they're buying and buy it very intelligently and not repeat anybody else's dumb old mistakes. We should only make interesting new mistakes and learn very quickly.
Sure, they will. Yeah, it's a critical. We're going to be doing a session this afternoon with RMI, WRI,
World
Wildlife, and NBSR,
Yeah.
each of which have buyer programs to try and sort of make some sense out of that.
The guy running this for us is Hervé Toiti, who was CEO of E.ON's renewables division, and it's shaping up well. But we need a number of other kinds of innovations. Finance, for example.
Yep.
The utility scale solar projects get lots of due diligence and can afford it. The residential ones are aggregated, and you diversify out a lot of the risk in the portfolio. The commercial rooftop stuff, however, is caught in between with, say, 3 days of due diligence, and probably 90% of the projects don't get through the funnel because they can't afford 3 days. So we've been working with and are now piloting with solar and financial houses something called True Solar, which is kind of like a FICO score for commercial rooftop solar projects that condenses all the risk conditions into one score. So you have 2 hours of due diligence. We think that'll help a lot.
Yeah, that's definitely what we need to make this simpler, as you were saying, and insanely great. Let's see if we have time for one question from Elaine, real quick, short one.
Yeah. So for maybe both of you, but mostly for Amory, I think in this case, please address the crucial enablers which are specifically relevant in, actually both of you. What do you think are the crucial developers in terms of specifically enabling the developing nations changing their energy use paradigms?
All right.
Developing what?
So basically, what are the leverage points in terms of what's going to be able to help developing nations in terms of changing their energy use paradigms?
That's a simple question.
Well, they're all different. I've worked in 65 odd countries. I've never seen two alike. Yeah. But quite often, everybody's trying to sell them something without their having a very sound grasp of how to buy in a smart way, or what to buy or what not to buy. And the supply industries tend to sell a lot better than the efficiency industries, so most of the capital ends up misallocated. If you invest in a factory to build LED lights or super window coatings in Mumbai or Bangkok, you will need about 1,000 times less capital, and you'll get it back 10 times faster than if you expand power supplies and grid in the conventional way to do the same lighting and comfort services. Multiply intensity times velocity, that's a 10,000-fold reduction in capital needed for the most capital-intensive sector, which eats a quarter of global development capital. If we buy cheaper negawatts first, we just turned the power sector from a black hole for capital into a net exporter of capital for other development needs. There is no more powerful macroeconomic lever for global development. And yet very few people in the international finance community and almost no finance ministers have ever heard that argument.
Okay, Matthew?
Yeah, I'd say it comes down to financial and political will, but there's a pretty big gap between sort of BRICS economy style developing countries, which can do that within a functioning government infrastructure, and then many places that need it most that have this opportunity to leapfrog a generation of infrastructure and not build transmission lines, not build distribution lines, but have distributed electricity.
Yep.
That's where I see a key role for mission-related investing, and philanthropy can fill a gap that non-functioning governments may not be able to fill.
There's never enough time to really do this topic justice. We could have done just another hour with both of you and taken lots more questions. But I think you've helped us frame up a lot of what we need to be thinking about going forward. And as we go into our breakouts and talk more about corporate buying power, I think it'll help us find that path forward that we're all desperately needing. So please join me in thanking Amory Lovins and Matthew Nordan.